All right. So, yeah, my name is Ron Cole Turner. I'm retired from a position where I taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Let me make sure I got this going right. I taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and Presbyterian related school. And the longer I was there, the more I became dissatisfied with the lack of focus on the spiritual lives of our students and of the people that they'd be ministering to. In spite of a major change in theological education in that direction. So that's part of the big obstacle if you're going to talk about psychedelic spiritual experience. So that was the context out of which I made a turn at retirement and basically said to myself, well, I want to devote the rest of my the remainder of the years that I have as somebody who can read and write to developing resources for the church to think about these questions. And so here we are. So I had a very specific focus in mind. I imagined a pastor. It could be any of you, any of your denominations, but I imagine a pastor getting a call, 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is on the table, and somebody goes through that. Maybe the pathways, depression, anxiety, addictive substance abuse disorders, PTSD, whatever. So they call the pastor and they say, you haven't seen me for 35 years, or the church hasn't. I've, been away, but I've just had this extraordinary experience. I don't know what to make of it. I can't shake the nagging question. Maybe this is leading me back to another look at Christianity. And so pastor says, well, okay. Person says, can I come in and talk? And pastor says, all right, come on in and talk. Hangs up the phone and then says, oh, phooey, or whatever the equivalent is in the Episcopal Church. What do I do now? And not to be too crass about it, but the answer is buy the book, right? Actually, the real answer is join Ligare and join this wonderful network, because that's really the mission of Ligare, is to educate and invite clergy into a process of being up to speed in helping guide people, support people, welcome people, invite people to talk about their unexpected experiences as a result of these substances. So, Megan, are you back with us? I see you had a little bit of a glitch there. Can you hear all right?
I'm back,
okay.
And as I predicted, the internet would fail, and
Okay.
you all went on beautifully, I'm sure.
Profit.
Okay. Well, it's back to you then.
Great. Then that means it's Molly's turn. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Feel free to plug your recent book as well. But also, especially what has brought you into this work.
You bet. Hi, I'm Reverend Molly Baskette. I am a working pastor. I currently serve as co-senior minister at First Church Berkeley UCC in Berkeley, aka Berkeley, California, in the Bay Area. I hail from New England originally, and I've been UCC my whole life, so I'm very familiar with mainline Protestantism, especially as the culture of New England Protestantism, and as liberal as we are, still very conservative and rigid, and not really big on big change. Nice to see some friends here. Hi, friends. I'm also an author, as Megan mentioned. My most recent book is a spiritual memoir / progressive. I call it sort of a progressive disaster theology or a systematic theology about how we not only survive, but thrive and hold on to God and faith through the hardest things that happen to us in life. It's called How to Begin When Your World is Ending, a spiritual field guide to joy despite everything. And in part, it recounts my experience as a young mom with cancer, 15 years clean at this point. And yeah, and how I had multiple mystical experiences, honestly, without benefit of these molecules. I came to this work. The active phase has only been about 2 years, but the more passive God sort of cooking things up in my soul came on about 7 years ago when I read Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, a very boring story. I was not, smote by God, riding my horse somewhere like Saul, becoming Paul. But God really did speak to me through that book as a pastor, as a longtime pastor who was really tired of seeing people I loved in my congregation stuck and really suffering from a variety of mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, PTSD, chief among them, and a number of other people just feeling really stuck in life, stuck spiritually, stuck with the choices they had made, and not able to find the courage or the perspective to really change things for themselves. So God knows me well. I'm a pragmatist, and God said, you're going to go get this training and you're going to find a way to apply it in your congregation. And it took me a few years. I blame the pandemic and raising teenagers one of whom was extremely curious about all kinds of drugs, particularly cannabis. I didn't want to muddy the waters there. He's 23 now, though, and very supportive of the work I'm doing. And last year, 23, 24, I took part in California Institute for Integral Studies psychedelic assisted therapy program, completed that, have also done some training through Polaris Insight Center in San Francisco, which is a ketamine clinic, but a number of their 3 chief teachers have been MAPS investigators for the MDMA studies. And I've taken a very personal interest in this work. It's not right to lead people where you have not gone yourself, understanding the risks and rewards. So for the first time in roughly 30 years since college, I've been experimenting on myself and with a few different molecules, and went into it very pragmatically, with my notebook, taking notes, and instead discovered so much more spiritual, emotional, psychological soul work that I could do, that I was in fact doing. And it's been really beautiful, and as challenging at times as it's been, also really, really fun. So that's where I'm at today. I'm working with a couple of MDs I met through my ketamine training to open a ketamine clinic here in the Bay Area in a couple months. And very, very hopeful that psilocybin in particular, and secondarily MDMA, become legal soon, because I think they're extremely powerful medicines and I want more people to have access to them. And that's really my chief place in this space. My chief posture is, while not dismissing the harms, to really destigmatize them, because so many people who could benefit from them are really, really scared. And it's sheer indoctrination. A number of them have said to me, Nancy Reagan really got to me with her message. People of all generations, say that. Just say no to drugs. This is your brain on drugs. And indiscriminately lumping in these powerful molecules with other powerful molecules.
Thanks, Molly. You're reminding me that we need to put on the slate the how to talk to your kids about your psychedelic use conversation.
Yes, by age and stage for sure, and personality type and risk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, riskiness.
Yeah. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, well, let's dive in a little bit. Ron, I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt from chapter 7. That's on page 126, where you list several areas that church leaders would need to consider if they're going to produce some kind of statement. So Ron's going to read this, and Molly, I want you to listen for the questions and proposals Ron's putting out as someone who is on the ground doing work in the UCC. To begin to educate that denomination formally and to push that denomination formally. And I'm curious if there's something on that list that feels like the easy first step, like, oh, we can do that. And if there's anything on that list that feels really scary.
Okay. I hope it's not scary. So I'm going to set this up with a sentence or two, and then I'm going to invite you just to sit back, possibly close your eyes while I read. The setup goes like this. We have statements on the books right now from our denominations, and like it or not, those statements are speaking for the churches, and their voice is more official, and it's a lot louder than Ligare's is. All right. So sit back and just listen for a bit. Imagine for a moment that one or more of our major denominations decided to create a new public statement on psychedelics. What would it say? It would begin by pointing out the theological foundations in scripture and tradition that highlight the importance of human experiences of encounters with the divine, noting the variety of forms these experiences can take. Critically and carefully, it would review current research, note the solid evidence of real health benefits, and commend the work of scientists. It would offer support and approval to any serious effort to offer psychedelic-assisted therapy, noting, of course, its concerns for availability, affordability, social justice, and the safety of vulnerable patients. A church statement would say a lot about so-called challenging or difficult psychedelic experiences, noting their psychiatric and spiritual dimensions. It would avoid hype, call attention to the numbers of people involved, and lament the failures of the war on drugs. It would pledge to support indigenous peoples and their traditions that use psychedelics, such as the Native American Church and Sante Daimo, and offer to cooperate wherever possible with the new plant sacrament churches, defending equal protections under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act for all sincere spiritual seekers. Above all, it would encourage and bless all those who, through their use of psychedelic drugs in any context, have come to a new spiritual awareness, regardless of their religious beliefs. It would encourage local congregations and leaders to extend a welcome to all who are seeking the presence of the Spirit, asking each church to pledge to be a safe place. Churches and their leaders should understand that there is no way to dodge these issues. If millions of people come through some version of psychedelic-assisted therapy, and some portion of them, half perhaps, have a spiritual experience as a result, and some fraction of these have questions for pastors and church leaders, what response will they receive? What will we say to those who turn to the church as a spiritual home in which they can talk safely and honestly about their experiences with psychedelic drugs? Saying nothing is not an option.
Molly, that's a tall order as someone who I think is the first, at least a part of the first effort that I know of any mainline denomination to begin to move through formal ecclesiastical structures around these questions.
Yes, I'll just say a quick word about that. A colleague of mine, Nathan Dannison, and some of his friends in Michigan wrote a resolution of witness, which is UCC jargon, because we're very flat hierarchy. We tend to work democratically. And his intention was to pass that in the Michigan Conference UCC and then bring it to the national. Our national biennial national gathering is in mid-July. For reasons of polity process, not moral objection. We can't bring that, but we have a really good working group now on the resolution and working at taking that to our local conferences and congregations to socialize that, educate, and then bring it back to the national setting as soon as possible, as soon as we have that, hopefully, groundswell of support. So yeah, I've been thinking and talking with others a lot about this. And Ron, that's an incredible encyclopedic list. I think the approach has to really be customized to each denomination and, for non-denominational churches to their local culture. I have Ligare and other Christian friends who are raised in charismatic traditions, who, for them, it's not a leap to the spiritual because they're used to meeting God. They're used to that union with God. They're not scared of it. I would put that lower priority on the list for UCCers, because I think there's some anxiety about that. I think of when I went to Nadia Bolz-Weber talk a number of years ago, and someone asked her, how do you reliably encounter God? And she said, why would I want to do that? Because it can be scary. For my purposes in the UCC, because we're such a cerebral tradition, we really honor, reason, faith in happy relationship with science. We've been focusing on the science, the data, the legitimacy of the bodies, providing that data, particularly, Johns Hopkins, the MAP studies over the last 25 years. And secondly, because social justice is so important to us, I'm going to kind of cut and paste your words a little bit, Ron, but to look at harm reduction, the war on drugs, and how a body like ours, a denominational body that still has some legitimacy and is seen as sort of a cultural, an institution that doesn't move too fast necessarily. If we can move into this space, if we can destigmatize it, if we can if not legalize, at least decriminalize. So, and address both the harms to the indigenous community, again, to sincere churches and to incarcerated people, particularly BIPOC people who we know are incarcerated at much higher rates, as well as give people receiving treatment in the underground redress if they experience harm by unskilled or unethical guides or therapists. So they're not scared to go to the cops, or so they know they have a hotline to call, so they can get the support and redress they need for the harms done. So that's where I would start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing up sort of the folks in very different denominations to ourselves. And I've been thinking about the charismatic folks a lot and the pressing concerns there around spiritual hygiene. I encounter God all the time. We have ways to do that. Are you really going to go into that deep end? There's so yeah, there's like going to be so many routes into what matters. I'm also
sorry, I was just going to say, I actually
go ahead.
For my final project for my CIIS certificate last year, I created a PowerPoint and I did a presentation for various churches called Divine Intervention, What Clergy and Congregations Need to Know About the Psychedelic Reemergence. And one of my first slides is just a funny New Yorker cartoon about God's frozen chosen. And this big question, do we really want to meet God? And then Sistine Chapel, God and Adam almost touching. So really just foregrounding that, because I feel like that's unconscious for a lot of people, but part of their resistance is, opening up the hood and getting a good look under there. Do we really want to know what's hidden deep in our psyches? Do we really want to be exposed in that way? That we are exposed when we meet God in that way. Yeah.
And it's not, it's actually a valid concern. And I want to actually speak to it because one of the things that Ron mentions at the beginning of the book, Ron, you're sort of going through the history of the 60s and the counterculture. And, I live in LA. Things like the Manson murders are still part of the cultural landscape in Los Angeles. We live in Hollywood. So you asked this question, could it all go wrong again? I don't think it's going to go wrong the way it went wrong in the 60s. If we, if we wouldn't want to even call that wrong, but Manson murders, yes. But in terms of cultural revolution, things unfurling, shaking out, it was messy for sure. But I'm wondering if you look around now, are there ways that you think it might go wrong this time?
Good question. Yeah, I was just at the Psychedelic Science 2025 event, and Molly, you're exactly right to call attention to harm reduction. That was a very big theme at Psychedelic Science, and I think if I rewrote this today, I would definitely highlight that theme. Although it's a real question how churches can play a role in that beyond just simply supporting what's already out there. But so the mood at Psychedelic Science was rather somber compared to 2023. In 2023, we thought, the eschaton was just moments away, and FDA was going to approve everything, and we were smooth sailing. Shock and horror, in August of 2024, FDA rejected the proposal supported heavily by the sponsor of that Psychedelic Science event. Goes by the acronym of MAPS. The FDA rejected the proposal based on some structural issues that were difficult, but also on a lot of pushback from critics. And it kind of, it just cast kind of a pall over the mood there in Denver. And not just that, but things like Matthew Perry's death, not using a regular psychedelic, but it was kind of raised those concerns again about the possible dangers of these drugs. So there was a lot of apprehension. Another thing that was referenced right in all of the major events was that the Johns Hopkins University publication that involved Hunt Priest and some others in the Ligare network as research subjects, that publication was massively delayed because of allegations of a research misconduct and very frustrating experience. On the other hand, I think you're exactly right, Megan. This is not going to stop the momentum that has built. One thing that's very different from the 1960s is that there's support across the political spectrum at this point. In 2023 and again here in 2025, Governor Rick Perry, who didn't do too well as a candidate for president for the GOP, but was pretty popular in Texas as governor, he spoke. He was instrumental behind the scenes in getting the state of Texas just to approve $50 million for ibogaine research to address chiefly PTSD on the part of veterans. And in fact, he was just kind of hanging around. I got out of a Uber one night coming back from something, and a big group of people waiting to go into the hotel, and I look kind of across the circle, and oh yeah, that's Rick Perry. Well, he was just mingling with folks and pushing it forward. That did not exist in the 1960s. That kind of across the political spectrum support. And there's some interesting signals from the new administration, still relatively new administration in Washington, kind of as you go down the chain of command from Secretary Kennedy on down. The state of New Mexico just voted a very significant opening towards psychedelic decriminalization and use in therapy. The Czech Republic in former Eastern Europe just through their national legislature just voted to support things. So things may be slower than once thought, but the advance toward FDA approval seems to be inevitable if slowed down. So I think we're going to see the reality of what I was projecting there when I wrote this, that millions of people will come through the process of psychedelic assisted therapy. Add that to the millions more who read that research and will turn to underground experiences as a way of kind of getting around the hurdles to research. They will and add to that, of course, that just the processes of decriminalization, increasing number of places where you can go, and you really don't have to be too worried about the police breaking down the door. So millions of people. And so my biggest worry is not that the momentum will be stopped, but that the church and other institutions will fail to meet the spiritual needs that arise during the process of integration as people try to make sense of these experiences. I mean, I really am apprehensive about this, and thank God for Ligare. It is the one big bright light on the horizon. What we need really is a Ligare transformed church, an awakening along the lines of the kind of vision that Ligare has lifted up as a challenge. We need to encourage our churches to stop condemning the use of psychedelics and to instead offer positive support, offer encouragement, extend discreetly but clearly and effectively an invitation to all people to come and share their experiences, including their psychedelic experiences, without the fear of being marginalized. In the book, I refer to the marginalization of the mystical, all the more so if the pathway to the mystical is through psychedelics. So what I'm hoping, well, what I fear is we will not have, and conversely, what I hope we will have is a theological stamp of approval, a kind of validation that says to people, your pathway to Christian spirituality is just as valid as any other pathway. In fact, you may have something really, really important to share to the Christian community to help wake it up to the importance of experience and the revitalization of the faith. So we need congregations to just step forward and say to people, welcome home. We need to hear your story. Bring us your story. We need you. Will we see that happen? It's my great fear that we won't, but God help us. That's what we're struggling for here with Ligare.
Thanks, Ron. Molly, I've heard you say, or kind of wonder aloud whether you think the church has enough cultural relevance to make a difference, and that the kind of difference that Ron is talking about. So where do you think we would need to go from there to show up in the way that Ron is suggesting we need to?
Well, as only someone who is a cradle person in my tradition, I can criticize it. And, the UCC is a smaller denomination. We've really struggled to, be seen, be visible and audible in the crowded marketplace of mainline Christianity, even as like mainline Christianity's whole brand sort of tanks, although that's leveled off to some degree. And I've been at a few churches now. I've served a few churches that were really struggling and dying and had some success either turning it around completely, depending on the culture and the team and the internal, willingness to assume some risk, to at least like leveling out a little bit. And paradox is very helpful. Paradox is our friend when we're working on evangelism, for lack of a better word, when we're working on getting people to see us and notice us and become curious about us. And I can't think of anything more paradoxical than a pretty traditional denomination taking a public stand on us, making a public witness, using the media to our advantage. To get a positive message out there, to undermine what people think of us. The UCC has done this very actively in regard to marriage equality and rights for queer and trans folks, as well as a number of other justice issues. Why shouldn't this be the next one? So that's on a big macro public level. And at a more interpersonal local level, we are herd animals, and we word of mouth is going to be really important in this situation. You know, that's why I'm so big on education and conversation, and let's talk about everything. And there's nothing you can say here that's wrong. And this is safe space, and this is confidential space. You know, we've had a couple gatherings at my church. We've done Zooms, that sort of thing. I put together this presentation. Let's make it safe to talk about all of these things. You know, since I came out as someone who was going to be formally studying this and practicing this, a number of people in my congregation came out to me as being psychedelic practitioners, or maybe not continually, but that, you know, big experience that changed everything for them, or that challenging experience that they wanted to talk about. And to people who think they're closed to this, you know, this wasn't in my church, but I was at a little family reunion earlier this week with my same age cousins who are somewhat conservative. You might know Massachusetts had a big ballot measure that could have passed if if they'd done better education, you know, because my cousins, married couple, said, we voted no because we thought more drugs, that's not good. One of them suffers from extreme anxiety, one from OCD. And when I explained that, they said, well, next time we'll vote yes. Like, it was that easy because they trust me, they trust the messenger, and so they trust the message. So we need to work at all those levels, mass media down to our personal relationships, particularly in church. And even people who have left church, you know, as Ron noted throughout the book, these are medicines that, even if you're an agnostic or atheist and you take them, are very likely to give you some kind of spiritual experience. And so maybe you're just in a ketamine clinic for treatment-resistant depression, but then you have mystical experiences, you have an encounter with God, you need to process that with someone, you need to find a tether. And our communities, if they're not naive about these medicines, if they have some grounding and training, a little bit of orientation can provide those spaces. For example, we know any number of these, ketamine in particular, we've seen Elon Musk, high as a kite, can promote grandiosity, particularly in individuals who are already wealthy or powerful, but even in other kinds of people. But we have our scripture and tradition and experience points us to humility. The tree will be known by its fruit. We are made in the image of God, but we're not God. If we have, you know, formal or informal spiritual directors, people to help us integrate this, it's going to be healthy for the movement as a whole.
Yeah, there's nothing like having to be a part of a community to combat your ego inflation.
Amen.
After a journey.
Amen.
Yeah, there's thank you for you had mentioned at one point, and you know, Molly's in the Bay Area, so the tech bro and the psychedelic bro and the Christian bro, like, we're, you know, the
How they're
money and power,
converging.
and they're
Yeah.
converging, the money and power in our culture, like, it's just unprecedented. And it just feels like such a moment where the church could show up and just ground.
I
Just
kind of, yeah, there's a church in San Francisco, Peter Thiel and his disciples are part of, and I actually literally want to show up someday and just see if I could, you know, wedge that open a little bit, offer a different perspective. So pray for me. Maybe you'll give me the courage to do that.
Okay, so I got kicked off, and now I'm on my phone, and I don't know how to do breakout rooms from my phone. So we have two options here. One is Molly and Ron might be able to do it because they're co-hosts. Two, and you can just give me a thumbs up. We have a question here for us. This is when we typically shift to breakout rooms. We could just practice posting some responses and do some quiet time in the chat, and then go into a time of large group, you know, reading some of those questions. But if Molly, you can handle it.
If I can handle breakout rooms?
Breakout rooms?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm looking right now. I haven't done it in a while, and I'm not sure. Does anyone know what it's under? It looked
And
under.
maybe it's not a thing a co-host can do. I don't remember.
Oh, Ron,
No, I see it, and I think I could
Okay.
do it, but
Right.
the question is, do we want to? And if so, how many rooms?
So if you want breakout rooms, since Ron can do it, give us the thumbs up. Oh, you're going to give me an even split again. All right. It looks like most people are not breakout rooms, I think.
Right. Seems
Okay.
like
Okay. All right. So then let's do this. I'm going to give you the question. Ron, I know you see this question, so if you want to copy and paste it into the chat, that will help people be able to respond. We're going to spend about 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes quietly just responding to this question in the chat. And then we'll shift into, you know, talking about it. People can unmute and come on and have some deeper conversation and do some Q&A that way. All right. So when you consider your own church, and if you're not a part of a church, maybe consider the church of your upbringing or the church of your lineage, or just the church as you imagine it. What do you think might be easy and what might be difficult about inviting people to rethink psychedelics? And then just sort of notice, is it theological? Is it political? Is it um, just momentum? Think about sort of what are the barriers and where might the wheels be greased in your own tradition. We'll just give a couple minutes for folks to respond and see each other's responses. So it can be short, it can be bullet points. Don't worry about grammar. Those little chat boxes are hard. Jeffrey, thank you for bringing up that question of syncretism and versus authenticity of tradition. It's certainly one that I think will land hard with Eastern Orthodox, but others as well. It's a lot for us to explore there. Okay. I'd love it if folks either want to unmute and share some perspective on what they wrote in the chat, and or ask Molly and Ron a question. And you can do that either just by coming offline and going for it, or if you want to raise your hand, then we'll have a clear sort of line to go in order. And if folks are nervous about going, Molly and Ron, if there's a comment that you want to highlight in particular, then go ahead and do that while we're waiting for folks to be brave.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was the number of people who mentioned therapy. And if therapy is approved, that would be an easier pathway to getting approval in the church. One person said, if it's proven therapy, of course Christians should support it. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's why I put therapy right at the beginning of the book. I think that's the easy pathway to making the case for the church. How can you not be for mental health therapy? So that's absolutely fascinating that a number of people picked up on that.
Molly, this is Tom Riedlinger. May I ask when you completed your training with CIIS?
last May 2024.
Well, I was in the cohort that was in practice or in process during 1922, and I withdrew from it. And one of the main reasons, very much so, was the degree to which they seemed not to recognize the importance of chaplaincy. They had put out a very specific call, which caught my attention and my wife's, for chaplains to apply. They said that they very much wanted that. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm already a therapist. My wife is a certified chaplain. She's ordained in the UCC. She applied as well. But when we actually began the training, there was almost no recognition of of the importance of chaplaincy. There were no breakout groups for chaplaincy. There were no cohorts. We raised the question about it. I was directed from one top administrator to another, claiming, oh, it was so-and-so's idea and such, and everybody washed their hands of it. There was nothing going on. And yet
Yeah.
I totally agree with what you and Ron have said about the importance of integration. Chaplains have an obvious, crucial role to play in psychedelic therapy, especially in the integration phase. You could argue at other phases as well. It seems to me integration and completely neglected.
Yeah.
I was quite disappointed. I withdrew from the training at that point. And since then, I don't feel I've seen a lot of emphasis on the importance of that. You know, I hate to be a lonely voice in the wilderness or seen by CIIS as opposed to their mission. I'm not at all, but I don't see that anybody's really advocating as strongly as I feel they need to for the chaplaincy component.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. It was certainly the same last year. There were 400 of us trainees, 200 in San Francisco, 100 online, 100 in Boston, and in San Francisco, maybe 7 or 8 of us were there as clergy or clergy-ish chaplain-y people. Probably 80 to 85% were therapists, some MDs, nurses, Chinese medicine practitioners. I think, you know, I think we're far from the groundswell yet. One of my teachers there who works at Polaris, Harvey Schwartz, Jewish, very deeply spiritual, that really came across in his teaching about, he taught the MDMA module. And so us clergy invited him to lunch and said, would you offer a ketamine training specifically for clergy? And he said, sure, sure, sure. And it took us a year to put it together. And then even Harvey and his community couldn't find enough clergy interested. So they made it ketamine experiential training for spiritually oriented practitioners. So again, it was like 80% therapists, but at least we were having distinctly spiritual conversations and spiritual experiences and processing it as such. I still had to credential myself in that I had to like prove I wasn't uptight or a white nationalist Christian, or, you know, all the ways we signal when we're in a room, a pluralistic, a spiritually or religiously pluralistic room. But it got a lot closer to what I was looking for and started the conversation. I think it's not really going to happen until it is legalized. People are starting to use them. And as Ron says, you know, pastors they need to understand. They need to like have some basic language and understanding around it. And then denominationally, you know, there's a little bit of pressure, like you have to get continuing ed every year. Why not do it in spiritual direction for folks using psychedelics? And so many of them end up having spiritual experiences, some of them challenging, and need someone to orient them to this.
I'm going to take a second and just flag something that Wendy put in the chat about Transforming Chaplaincy, which is a great organization for chaplains, and very easy to connect with. And, you know, also, Tom, I also went through that program and had a similar experience. That program operates largely out of a pretty transpersonal psychology approach. And there's also this implicit assumption that they actually don't need the religious perspective, or that chaplains aren't necessarily doing anything that's different from what a transpersonal psychologist or someone trained in that tradition is doing. And so I'm sensitive to the hubris that I think you're detecting, because I also felt like, oh wait, you think it's kind of all the same. This is why we had the perennialist conversation a couple weeks ago, because there's an assumption that it is that there's not something distinct for spiritual care providers to offer, or for religious organizations to offer in particular, even if they're open to it because they know they're supposed to be. There's just not enough education, I think, in that world. Wendy and I also both went through UC Berkeley. What's that?
And a lot of built-in bias toward us as religious people. I'll just say it.
Well,
Yeah.
just to state the obvious, it's so amazing because the psychedelic renaissance, so-called, began with the findings of that study in 2006 or so. And ever
Yeah.
since then, there's been great emphasis on the idea of spiritual edification emerging out of these scientific studies consistently, a major component. And I'm not going to name names, but I tracked down who allegedly was responsible for introducing in the CIAS paperwork, calling for applicants, that they really wanted chaplains. And that was somebody who absolutely should have also uh, advocated, I think, for a significant role, and yet did not. I think my sense is because not enough chaplains had signed up. And so they just didn't, they undervalued the significance of the cohort. In my view, whether it was 2 or 3 or 12 chaplains, they should have used that as a starting point and really begun to build, because in my view, and I'm sure it's not just me, that's so important a component in light of what emerges out of these experiences for at least the integration phase. But that I get, that's my full statement on it. Thank you
Thanks, Tom.
for your input. It's encouraging.
Thanks, Tom. Oh, Ron, you're muted.
Yeah, Trip, go ahead.
Okay. Just to go back a minute to what the question was. I kind of had a thought after I replied about it. So the Presbyterian church that I grew up in, my grandparents were elders, which from my understanding is kind of like a board that helps make decisions on a local basis. But and so like if I would have seen like, okay, what happens if psychedelics are legal for therapy and medical use, I know that they'd be accepting of people who used them, but I don't think that any of those people would have ever been accepting of the religious aspects of them. And they certainly would not have tried them. And even my grandmother today, she's accepting of the medical use, but she's like, I've lived my whole life without it. I don't need it. But and so I just think it'd be really hard. I don't know how the other Christian denominations are structured, but I think it'd be very hard to get the church to incorporate psychedelics for spirituality, because most of the people that are a part of the church are middle-aged or younger who are actually having these experiences. And so my question is, how many of these churches, because of their hierarchy system, are going to end up splitting into a new church that is from the very beginning a Christian church focused on entheogens?
Well, I hope for goodness sake we don't see churches split. I mean, they seem to split so readily these days, and that is a real concern that could happen. It won't take a movement that sweeps across all traditions and all congregations. If in any major metropolitan area we can have a few churches that kind of venture out, put out the signals, you're welcome here, we're open to talk with you. I would find that to be evidence of the success of Ligare. I would count that as Ligare achieving its objective, as long as people have access to churches like that. But you're absolutely right, Tripp. I think for a lot of Christians, they're going to hold back until they have not just scientific evidence, but actual FDA approval and maybe insurance companies paying for this. But there's a really interesting debate going on. Can we have healing without the trip? And the insurance companies would love healing without the trip. It'd be cheaper. But the pharmaceutical companies would love healing without the trip. It put them front and center in the whole process. Paradoxically, some Christian traditions would prefer healing without the trip. They support therapy. They don't like the idea of experiencing this, encounter with the divine, because that becomes then a little bit spiritually threatening to the structure, to the hierarchy, to the system of dogma that holds that tradition together. So it's a very strange moment. I mean, I've seen articles written by religious leaders, very thoughtful articles, in which they endorse healing without the trip as the best pathway for Christians. And meanwhile, I'm looking at that thinking, my goodness, we really need more Christians who have some sort of a jolt to their spirituality and are awake and alive, don't we? But not everybody agrees with that.
What's that line from Flannery O'Connor? The Church of God without God, or the Church of Jesus Christ without Christ. That's what that makes me think about.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I want to flag something that Katie put in the chat about needing to unlearn the systems that ever told us these things were problematic to begin with, because one of the things that is going to come up for all churches right now is a new question about the relationship to the state. And all of our churches, all of our denominations have different histories, whether wherever we are, especially in the Protestant spectrum, but for everyone, about our relationship to state power and where we get where authority comes from. So unlearning those systems and who says it's okay and why is, I don't know if that's ever going to be the crux of the matter for whether Christians, it depends on FDA approval and all that, but I think it's going to matter.
Heather said something really pertinent in the chat about reckoning with psychedelics open up our colonizer wounds. And I think that's part and parcel of the conversation. I mean, both internally, when you think about what happened when my ancestors, physical and spiritual, my lineage was the Pilgrims and the Puritans who came here and decimated the native populations intentionally and unintentionally. How we, how we were high control and it was, we came here to escape religious persecution, then imposed it. And then internally too, I had people on both sides of the Salem witch trials, which is, after all, a way of, subverting the power of women and men in some cases who claimed to, who either, in some cases had made no claims to any kind of spiritual power authority, just got caught up in the madness, or who were in fact, wise women and men or medicine workers and healers. So, it ignites the whole conversation, and opens up that wound.
Thanks for saying that about Molly. And I want to add, I want to challenge a little bit Tripp's assumption that that it's young people or middle-aged and younger who are experimenting and having experiences with these medicines. In fact, we have a retired Presbyterian who's nearing 90 in our congregation who has outed herself repeatedly as a past pastor that she had her most important spiritual experience of her life was on LSD. And so I think, and I've said this in another meeting that Molly and I were in, I look to the movement to make churches safe for queer people as an interesting model, because there were always queer people in the church, but the church was not a safe place in all of its parts for those conversations. As members of the church have slowly started to out themselves and support those who, are willing to be outed, people start to realize, wait a minute, this is everywhere. I didn't know. I had assumptions about who was straight that were wrong. I've known people all along who were this way. I've loved people who are this way. This is a core component of their personality, their life experience, their healing, their spiritual walk. I think a similar model regarding psychedelics in the church might be fruitful. And I think when we go full top down through our hierarchies, that's right, we get a lot of resistance because we're built on orthodoxies. But when we sort of start to empower the gentle outing, as Molly said, of those who have had powerful experiences with this and understand that, I think resistance softens because everybody knows somebody they love that have had this experience, and that starts to get folks thinking. So just as a word of hope.
It's also interesting to note that the number of older folks, elders in Ligare is quite remarkable. We are not a group of young folks. Trip, you might be one of the outliers. And we're seeing, at least just in the membership, kind of this contingent of folks who actually don't have, they're like, I'm retired. I don't have anything to lose, in my congregation anymore. I'm really curious. Yeah, Trip, go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, I mean, I do think that Ligare is like a middle-aged average, but with the 90-year-old, I'm curious to know, were the experiences that she had with psychedelics like in the 60s and 70s, or are these recent? What age was her first experience roughly?
I think she and her husband tripped in their 40s or 50s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like, from my experience with the church I grew up in was just mostly retired people, and like unless none of them, as far as I know, had ever done psychedelics back in the 60s or when LSD was still legal. But I just know that those people would never use them themselves. I mean, like you said, unless they knew somebody who they trusted a lot that encouraged them to do it. But I did also want to comment on on one thing else you said there. I know of one church which is primarily focused on psychedelics and neurodivergent and queer people. That church is based out of Tennessee, and it's called Prisma, and I'm somewhat friends with the founder. But I don't think there's a whole lot of Christian influence in it. If there is, it's not official. And then there's another church called Sanctuary, spelled with a PS, like psilocybin, that focuses on mushrooms. And so they are a non-denominational church, although the founder, at least one of the founders, is an ex-Catholic. But it's interesting too, because they have an entire program dedicated to queer people, or LGBTQ, I think is, they haven't done the I can't remember the other letters, forgive me, but the full acronym, they have not added all the letters to it, so maybe they're a little behind on that, but they do focus a lot on that. So
I see Rick's
All
hand
right.
up. I know Katie had her hand up, and I just wanted to offer a 20-second anecdote. A 75-year-old corporate attorney in my church had his first psychedelic experience last summer out of curiosity, intellectual curiosity, and gave a testimony about it in church. I wasn't even there that Sunday. And it was incredible. Like, it just gave all of us more room to have this conversation.
Sounds like Katie and then Rick, and if you both could keep your questions short so we can try to hit sort of our time.
Yeah, I guess maybe I don't need to speak because I think actually, Megan, you said what I was going to say. So I'll pass mine on to Rick and let him talk.
Okay.
I need some help here. In a church, as a religious institution where the mystical is held suspect, is the starting point really, in terms of psychedelically induced mystical experience, might the starting point be just mystical experience itself, or the mystery? I don't know. Help me out here.
Can
I
you,
think
can-
well, go ahead, Molly.
I was going to say, can you say that a different way? Because I'm not sure your question's landing for me.
Well, I'll give it a try. My experience as a pastor and a priest is that, in general, with those who attend church and go to regular churches, the mystical is held suspect. just in and of itself. And if my conversation with those folks begins with psychedelic mystical experience, it seems, maybe I'm wrong here, but it just seems not starting at the fundamental point. The fundamental point is, what is your experience with mystery itself?
Sounds
I
like
mean,
you
is
answered
it
your question.
sounds like what?
Dave?
Like you answered your question. Like that's a place to start.
I think, well,
Well,
I don't know. I don't know.
well, that is why in the book, when I begin to move to the theological, that's exactly where I start. What is the attitude of traditional biblical Christianity toward experiences of encounters with the divine and the history of mysticism? Only after that. And so I totally agree with you, Rick. The deeper problem is the fear of direct experience, religious experience, encounters with the divine, mysticism, whatever you call it. In so many of our churches, that's just kind of tamped down, or in some of our churches explicitly silenced. Again, Karl Barth being sort of the poster child of the silencing. But so we have to overcome that hurdle. I'm hoping that just the sheer number of people who have psychedelic occasioned mystical experiences begins to force the conversation on our churches. How do we think about mystical experiences in general? And then how do we welcome those with psychedelic mystical experiences as one of many pathways, and begin to invite in people with near-death experiences and all the other pathways to a greater, richer, more inclusive, non-judgmental conversation. It's a high bar, but I think we can get there.
So, Ron, if I understand what you're saying, it's perhaps those who have had psychedelic mystical experiences could be encouraging or a guide to those who hold the mystical as suspect?
I think that will happen inevitably in some places. Will it happen in more than 1 out of 100 congregations? I don't know. I hope so. But as these things become more and more ordinary in the culture, people are going to be talking more and more freely. I know we're near the end, and there's one thing I wanted to mention that I learned that in Denver, there's a research proposal that is well along toward funding that will target older adults. We were talking about older people a moment ago. There are two considerations. One is the capacity of these substances to trigger neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, thereby addressing possibly dementia. Simultaneously, the tendency of dementia and aging to lead to depression. These substances address depression. Could you address both of those in an older population? If that study goes forward and gets reported and leads to approval, and in 10 years this is routine among older adults, well, just ask yourself, what kind of a world would we be in ecclesiastically? It would be a very different world. So it's absolutely fascinating what we are about to see out of this research, as I think it's inevitable that we will see FDA approvals in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years and on from there.
Ron, I just want to affirm, it's quite likely that the culture will mainstream on this, and we'll have our backs against the wall needing to go brush off all of our theological and mystical and contemplative knowledge from 2,000 years of history, to brush it off and get ready. Not necessarily that we're going to be wise, as you're saying, and just center this to begin with. So, maybe the question for folks in this group is, wherever we are, can we create as many pathways Can we be gracious to folks as they're learning so that as many folks as possible can kind of get to the finish line that we're looking for, and just acknowledge that it's going to be a lot of different routes for different people and different traditions. So it's really good today to actually just to see that chat and see the different concerns that folks are going to run up against, and begin to imagine, how are we going to do it wherever we are in our local communities.
You know,
All right.
Megan, I would add to that, please, just a moment, that can we, or those of us who are in positions of pastoral leadership, be humble enough to learn from those who come to us with their experiences?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wake up, not there to, yeah. We're there to be curious as much as anything, and give room for them to unspool it all.
Yep.
Eager to learn.
Can I jump in here? And I'm just so struck by the concurrence to your question, Rick, that came up last night at a lecture at Seattle University on the religious landscape of the Pacific Northwest, where it's been, where it's moving. And at the end of the evening, a very strong pitch was made that churches need to ask members where they look, what do they consider holy? What's the holy? Which avoids all the baggage that comes with, mysticism. Are we nervous about it? Do we need to put it down or whatever? And if we can assume that there are and there will be more people turning to churches who have had some intense spiritual experience with psychedelics, or who need the therapy that can lead them there, they will not shy away from speaking up if asked, what's holy to you and where do you seek it?
It's a great final question, David. Yeah, I mean, and it's a good one for us to be asking in our communities. Maybe that's a way to start the conversation about psychedelics, with the folks in our churches. Ron and Molly, thank you for rounding us off on session 4. And Ron, thank you for all the time you've given us for 4 sessions these past weeks.
Well, thank you to everyone, but especially Megan, who's just really pulled this together brilliantly. But thank you, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Well, we know we like book studies, so we'll do it again when the next book comes out that's Ligare appropriate. And there's breath work tomorrow and other things on the calendar too. So go check it out, and we will see you on a Zoom call soon. Thank you all for being here, especially those of you who have been coming week after week. It's been great to see your faces and to get to know you and hear your questions and concerns. And we'll keep experimenting with different ways of being together. So it won't always be a study. It won't always be cerebral. Sometimes it will. But we'll also begin to experiment in some other ways of holding space together. So look for that towards the end of the summer, coming into the fall. All right, you all. God
Thank you all.
bless.